Hello and welcome to the West London Sport QPR podcast with me, David McIntyre, just me for the moment, with something a bit different, but the type of thing that should be the norm really, and hopefully will be moving forward. Now, having been very kind about West London Sport for many years, I have seen some fans say that our QPR coverage over the past couple of years hasn't been what it was. They're right, and there are good reasons for it, and reasons why it was always a temporary situation, which I'm not going to bore you with, and instead just get back to doing what the local media should be doing, frankly. I think there's been a general feeling that there's a lack of transparency when it comes to QPR. Now, I'm certainly not in the business of defending them, but I will say the radio silence has been as much as possibly even more to do with us than it has with them. And that's something that we need to address by hopefully beefing our QPR coverage back up. A lot of fans have questions about the running of the club. What's going on? Who does what? Who does such and such a role? What does it involve? This is the kind of thing we should be all over. We have been in the past, and it's always been our intention to get back to it. It's important now more than ever, really. I want to spend some time delving into what goes on at that club, who does what, and also the important question of what is the plan or direction. Is there any kind of direction? One of the many things I get asked, for example, is what does a head of methodology do? It's a grand sounding role the club advertised for last year and was filled by Jon De Souza, who was actually known on our patch because he used to be at Brentford. Some of you will have heard Kevin Gallen on the podcast question that role. And I recently did say, and a few listeners have since reminded me, that I'd look to get Jon on. So I did, and he agreed, as I knew he would. And last week I caught up with him. I wanted to address some of the questions that are being asked out there. The main question is usually, what does a head of methodology do? What does the role involve? So that's what I began by asking him.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, Dave, and it's a role that's fairly prevalent in Europe, but very unique here in England. And essentially, my job is to work with all teams, so from men's and women's senior team right down to our under-8 academy players, to support coach development, player development, and team development, to ensure that we're working kind of in an aligned way, and players and staff are able to progress through the age groups without too much change.
So what does a typical day involve then, Jon?
I guess the beauty about my role is it changes day to day, week to week. So essentially there's 13 teams that I try and work with and support. And my job is to make sure I'm across all those teams, to have an understanding of the work that's being done, to support the work that's being done. So on any given day, I could be out watching our first team men's, our under-8 boys, our women's team. And it's a mixture of making sure the support's out on the pitch. I'm a coach at heart, and I'm really passionate about the work that's being done out on the pitch, but also the bigger picture strategizing in terms of making sure we've got clear processes and plans in place.
It's a different title, but isn't it essentially the same job Chris Ramsey was doing when he was at the club?
I can't comment on what Chris's role was previously. In principle, there might be some similarities, but ultimately I wasn't here when Chris was here. So my role at the moment is to support, like I said, those players, teams and coaches across the club. And obviously those that were here previously can make the comments on how similar that is to Chris.
I mean, in terms of overseeing coaching at all levels of the club, I suppose it is quite a similar role. I mean, Chris had his critics. I know you can't comment on him specifically, and the club certainly had shortcomings during his time there, but you will be aware that he is very well respected in that field. And so too is Mark Warburton, who has fairly recently been manager here, and I know you know him from your Brentford days. I suppose the awkward question, Jon, is that those are two very seasoned operators in the area of coaching and development. The issue, I suppose, is whether the current setup has that kind of know-how, whether the club is actually moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I know both very well. Chris is a good friend of mine. Mark's also a friend of mine, and I work closely with him at Brentford. I guess it depends on what you or whoever makes those comments would describe as experience. I mean, I'm entering my 20th season as a coach. I've been probably, of those 20 seasons, maybe 16, 17 in senior coaching positions or senior leadership positions. I've worked in every league from kind of Championship to League Two in the majority of positions. I've been a technical director. I've been a first team coach. I've been an under-21 coach. And the previous 2 seasons before joining QPR, I worked for the Premier League. And my role there was to support first team coaches and assistant coaches in the Premier League become future head coaches. So, I can only comment on my experiences. And I feel like 20 years of experience in professional football, majority of them being in senior leadership positions, is someone that probably has got a fair degree of experience. It might not be as much as some people, it might be more than others, but I do feel like I've got the relevant experience to do such a role and a role effectively.
There's been a lot of talk about the game model, Jon, both when the club were looking for someone for your role and since you filled it. Can you explain a little bit about, in layman's terms, what the game model basically is and your role in upholding it?
Yeah, so the game model basically is what are the playing principles and coaching principles that the club want to build. So I obviously wasn't here when Marty was appointed, but he was appointed within those principles because he demonstrated in previous jobs how aligned he was to the kind of game model of the club. But essentially what we're trying to build is a way of working that can be consistent over a period of time to avoid squad turnover, to avoid staff turnover. And I'm sure, as QPR fans, there would have been some experiences of maybe going from one coach who had a certain style and certain principles to another coach that was slightly different. And I think with that just causes a high level of squad turnover. So we're just trying to build some consistency in the way we play, the way we recruit, the way we develop. So there isn't that consistent turnover year on year or week on week even.
In terms of a game model, though, does it include a specific style of play?
Yes. So the game model is very much based on the principles of play with the ball and without the ball. And our job is to make sure that we bring players and staff that are aligned with that game model and that can kind of develop and improve that game model as well.
I mean, just in terms of a game model, I mean, 2 seasons in a row, there's been a significant shift in terms of style in order to get enough points to stay up, basically. And I suppose that leads to 2 questions, really, Jon. The first is, how can it be said that the model is fit for purpose, given that, it's had to be adjusted 2 seasons in a row? And second, what's the point in having guardians of that game model when it can be so easily changed?
When you say it's been adjusted and changed, what principles do you think would be kind of the big things that have changed over the 2 years?
Well, I suppose the main one would be the perception that maybe there's been a willingness or a preference of the head coach for playing out from the back, playing a certain kind of possession style. And when it's not gone well, obviously we've seen Jimmy Dunn come in at right back for an extra header in both boxes, and perhaps the style has been a little bit more direct. So nothing overly major, but I suppose most people would perceive it as a significant style change in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I would disagree in significant styles. I obviously can't comment too much on last season. I wasn't here last season, but we're really clear in the way we want to play, and Marty's really clear in the way he delivers the style of play at first team. We measure it consistently, and we discuss kind of performances consistently. And I would hit back on the fact that there's been kind of significant changes. There are always tweaks and changes because personnel plays a part. Home and away plays a part, but ultimately, we've got a certain style that we want to follow, and we believe those principles have been adhered to within reason.
I mean, you say you hit back on that. You might hit back on this one as well, which is a perception which you may be familiar with. You've probably heard it a bit. A perception that you can get a manager, stroke head coach who often has a playing career behind him. He's certainly got significant coaching and managerial experience. He's the one at the sharp end. He's the one who's most judged by people on results and whose head is essentially on the block. And there's a perception that maybe that expert, for want of a better word, is being kept in line by people without that background who aren't as accountable. What would you say to that?
Yeah, look, I think we're trying to modernise the way we do things here, as a lot of clubs are, right? And where you said around the head coach having to fit in, we don't see our structure like that at all. We're working alongside and with a head coach. So it's very much, our job is to make sure, like we have with Marty, we have a head coach that can, we believe, deliver the game model principles and the style of play that we want to play, and then give him the freedom and the support to deliver that day in, day out, and week in, week out. So, the structure is very much here to support a head coach, and make sure, the head coach is given all the tools to be as successful as he possibly can be.
You briefly mentioned recruitment, Jon. I know you're involved on that side as well. I know you work quite closely with Andy Belk, the head of recruitment. Can you maybe say a little bit about your involvement there?
Yes, I'm involved at kind of all levels. So one thing I'll possibly touch on now, and maybe with some further questions, if you do go down that route, is we've very much adopted a club-wide policy, and recruitment is one of those departments that is kind of overreaching over the club. So where previously, there might have been some departments within a club, so maybe an academy recruitment team and then a first team recruitment team, we now have club-wide departments, and methodology being one, performance, goalkeeping, individual development, and recruitment is one of those. So I work closely with Andy in the academy space and in the first team space. I'm presuming your question is probably aimed mainly at the first team space. Mm-hmm. I speak to him daily on players, because obviously we want to provide our pathway for our young players. So my relationship with Andy Belk is extremely strong. Day-to-day conversations around, suitability of players within our positional profiles, within our game model, and also comparing future signings to what we have inside the building as well.
I mean, Andy's part of what I understand, unless it's changed, but last I understood was part of a 4-man committee, for want of a better word, when it comes to bringing in players. That's himself, the CEO, the head coach, and the head coach's assistant. Why aren't you part of that, given your role, or are you essentially part of it by proxy because of your relationship with Andy?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and ultimately, I'm involved up until kind of the final stages. I think a combination of reasons, really. Like we said at the start, we want the head coach to have big influence in terms of decisions in the first team. But the biggest reason for me is ultimately I feel like my job is to look after what's inside the building, and to be able to remove biases. If I'm part of the decision making at the end of whether a player gets signed or not, as you can imagine in any walk of life, there's biases once you give an opinion to it. What I really want to make sure from a coaching perspective, if we set standards that whoever comes into the building, we really want to try and develop them and make them better and improve them, regardless of any biases that are involved. So I think it's crucial that, I see my role very much as the focus of looking after what's inside the building and really trying to strive to improve, whatever players in the building. Our job is to give them the platform, the facilities, the support to be able to improve. So that's a big passion for me that, as coaches, I'm trying to create an environment here at the club that our job is to make these players better, regardless of the level they're brought into. We've got to try and make them better.
You did mention that club-wide approach, as you called it. Can you maybe expand a little bit on what that involves?
Yeah, I think it's huge for us, right? So like Marty's been at the club over a year now, which is fantastic. And believe it or not, that's probably ahead of the curve for most championship coaches. Believe, as we talk right now, the average time for a head coach is 9.8 months. So the turnover of head coaches, unfortunately, in the championship is high. So what we're trying to do as a club is be able to provide Marty and any head coach the opportunity to hit the ground running. And to do that, we need to be able to give them, the best support possible across all departments. So we're trying to build club-wide departments that make sure there's some alignment. So, a head coach can come in and be able to deliver what he's been appointed for. So we've got Kevin Betsy, for example, who works with the first team as a first team coach. His main role is to work on individual development. So we have a clear individual development pathway for all our players at the club. And that starts with the first team. All our players have individual development plans. We review them every 6 weeks. So I sit down with, the under-9 coach and Kev Betsy at our first team to discuss how players are improving and developing. Andrew Sparks, who's the first team goalkeeper coach, is actually head of goalkeeping. He makes sure that, all our goalkeepers are being developed in the same way. We had a club-wide CPD where we had Paul Nardi deliver to every single goalkeeper and goalkeeper coach around the aspects of goalkeeping. And I've already touched on recruitment. So the idea is to make sure, whoever comes in at first team level has got the support of the football club, because we're working in similar ways. And ultimately, and it's crucial for us, we've got to make sure that we've got a pathway for all our staff and players. And to do that, you need to have staff and departments that are able to support first team and academy departments all at once. I
mean, just finally, Jon, and you already have touched on this. isn't a lot of this really about, to some extent, shock-proof in the club in terms of changes of manager stroke head coach, which do happen? As you said, the average shelf life of a manager is actually quite short. And often when you get a change, you not only have to change the manager, you change your backroom staff. There's a change of style of play, which means that some of the players can become surplus to requirements. I think over the years, I've seen QPR wrestle with this quite a bit. The biggest example would be, long before your time here, Mark Hughes, who came with an entourage and left with one. Mick Beale, who came in with great ideas and went after a very short period of time. And that had a huge impact on the club. Is the idea really about eliminating or at least reducing those kind of issues when they arise?
Absolutely, yeah. I think unfortunately, if the average time is just under 10 months as a head coach, we've got to be able to get success beyond a head coach. Now, ideally, we can go on and be successful with one head coach for a period of time, like maybe Arsene Wenger and Sir Alex Ferguson did, but that's unlikely now. So for us to be successful beyond one coach, we've got to make sure we have some systems and some processes, some staff in place that can support the current coach and future coaches, right? And I describe my job as a way of kind of supporting the here and now and trying to support QPR winning now, but also support QPR winning in 5 years' time. And that's that fine balance, right? And if we're forever turnover, like you've suggested, around staff and players, the only way really we can successfully sustain a top-end championship level team is through increasing our budget. So we've got to be really clever with kind of the money we spend on players. We've got to be really clever with the money we waste on players and staff leaving. But ultimately, we need to create a player trading and a staff trading model that increases our budget year on year or window on window so we can be successful in the long term. And that's probably the key point for me is, like, I'm sure there's some discussions around whether the game model's working, whether the way we're trying to identify younger, more hungry players with higher resale value. But ultimately, we do have a clear plan. We're really clear with what we're trying to achieve, and whether people agree with it or disagree with it, we're really keen on making sure there's clarity within that plan, and we're really kind of motivated and working relentlessly to achieve that plan in the medium to long term.
So there you have it. I hope you found that a decent listen, and we'll have another podcast for you next week, hopefully. Cheers.